All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 31, Section 3, A New World Order. So probably one of the most significant developments of the 1980s is the end of the Cold War, which had really characterized American foreign policy all the way from 1945, which was the ending of World War II, until 1989, which is often cited as the year that the Cold War ended. The later years, of course, 1980 through 1988, that was the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and probably the most significant accomplishment of the Reagan administration and the Reagan presidency was the ending of the Cold War and how it ended. The fact that both the Soviet Union and the United States avoided nuclear war, which had seemed at least, throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even 70s to a certain degree, that was a very real likelihood. So Reagan himself, when he came into office, took a much more aggressive stance towards the Soviet Union than his predecessors, especially when compared to a guy like Richard Nixon. He referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. So this was a reference to the Soviet Union. All right, and we'll just say the Cold Warrior is Ronald Reagan. Doing things like not just the rhetoric that he used in terms of the Soviet Union, but also resuming the arms race, for example, whereas presidents like Richard Nixon had worked, and really a lot of other U.S. presidents worked to reduce the number of, hydrogen and nuclear and atomic weapons. Ronald Reagan accelerated that more, so a much more confrontational approach. And one thing that Reagan did not suffer from was Vietnam syndrome, and Vietnam syndrome was, of course, it's named after the U.S. experience in the Vietnam War. It was kind of the questioning of what we might call maybe the role of the U.S. in the world. Vietnam syndrome is a term used to describe really kind of those who are much more hesitant in terms of thinking that the United States has some sort of global responsibility. Really before the Vietnam War, it was a matter of the United States being able to, or at least should be able to, intervene everywhere at every time, and that American intervention in the world would always yield a positive result. Vietnam syndrome is kind of the questioning of that. It is saying, well, maybe America can't always do good in the world. Maybe America shouldn't always do good around the world. Ronald Reagan did not suffer from this, right? He did not suffer from Vietnam syndrome. He was very much confident in the ability for the United States to be everywhere, do everything, and perhaps more importantly, or most importantly, to always kind of do good, so to speak, right? That the United States could do no wrong, essentially, in the rest of the world. And again, this is kind of a shift, you might say, in terms of the prevailing kind of wisdom of the time period. So just for example, I'll just go ahead and go over a couple of interventions that took place under the Reagan presidency. Lebanon, this was a country in the Middle East. Ronald Reagan sent in peacekeeping forces. They were attacked in Lebanon, eventually retreated. So this was one thing that Reagan was also willing to do, was to be flexible in terms of foreign policy. This proved more or less that it was different than kind of the ongoing commitment that Vietnam had presented. Grenada, which is a very small island in South America, this was a very what we might call quick victory for the U.S. There was a sort of a leftist or communist faction that had taken over Grenada. A number of U.S. college students were taken hostage there. U.S. forces went in there, took care of business. It was kind of a good victory in terms of making Americans forget about the agony of the Vietnam War. In Nicaragua, this is in Central America, you had a communist regime come to power, or at least poised to come to power, the Sandinistas. The Contras were anti-communist fighters in South America. And what Reagan wanted to do was to send U.S. dollar bills, right, U.S. money, give those to the Contras so they could fight against the Sandinistas there. Congress, fearing that Nicaragua could turn into a Vietnam syndrome or a Vietnam situation where the United States sort of perpetually gets stuck or gets sucked into this conflict. Remember, the United States got sucked into the Vietnam War by essentially aiding France, who was an anti-communist, aiding strongmen like No Dinh Diem, and eventually, sooner or later, you had 500,000 troops in Vietnam. Congress cuts off funding to the Contras, and this is actually different than what the Reagan administration and the CIA wants to do. It eventually sparks off what becomes known as the Iran-Contra scandal. All right, we'll talk about that here in a second. In the 1980s, Iran and Iraq went to war with each other. Initially, the U.S. supported Iraq. Recall what happened in Iran last chapter. You had the Iranian Revolution, where a number of American hostages were taken. So you had a very hostile regime in Iran, a very anti-American regime in Iran. And because these two countries went to war, the United States supported Iraq because of some of those hostilities there. But anyways, the scandal, the Iran-Contra scandal, emerges over this foreign policy, and that is what eventually becomes weapons sales. So remember, the United States was giving money, right, to the Contras, which were anti-communist fighters, right? Here we have, let's go ahead and use a different color to make this a little bit more clear. So we have U.S. money going to these fighters, these anti-communist fighters in Nicaragua. Congress cuts off the funding, so the Reagan administration can't continue to support these anti-communist fighters, but the Reagan administration continues to want to do that. And so in order to get the funds necessary for the Contras, weapons are sold to Iran. So essentially you have a situation where even in this Iran-Iraq war, the U.S. eventually ends up selling weapons to both sides. But weapons get sold to Iran, which was, marked as a terrorist state, according to the United States. And that money secretly, without Congress knowing, was going back to these Contra fighters. This becomes known as the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, Reagan himself never really, the scandal doesn't really stick to him as much as, let's say, the Watergate scandal stuck to President Nixon. Reagan was a president who really didn't micromanage, didn't know the details, was sort of aloof. And so he claimed essentially ignorance when it came to this scandal, and that was essentially good enough for the American public, so to speak. But this was perhaps probably the lowest point in terms of Reagan's popularity as president. However, it's also overshadowed by what's going on in the Cold War. And again, the scandal between Iran and Nicaragua really has no comparison to the overall Cold War, which really had been dictating American foreign policy and even domestic policy for an entire generation. There were an entire generation of Americans who knew nothing but the Cold War. That was their kind of entire experience. Reagan, like we said before, was somebody who accelerated the arms race. The SDI, or Strategic Defense Initiative, was a missile defense system for the United States, potentially to shoot down Soviet nuclear bombs, hydrogen bombs, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and it was expensive. And, because this is the Cold War, remember that every dollar the United States spends, here we have Ronald Reagan, for every dollar the U.S. spends, the Soviet Union, we have Mikhail Gorbachev here, has to match that dollar in order to keep pace in this arms race. And essentially what it boiled down to, or what some of it boiled down to anyways, was that simply in terms of the economic systems, the United States economic system was just much more better prepared to handle this immense or this acceleration in arms spending. Now, when it comes to the falling of the Soviet Union, there is perhaps nobody more responsible for the falling of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War than Mikhail Gorbachev. He became the premier, however you spell premier, I think Premier, premiere in the 1980s. Now, the Soviets had already been going through some tough foreign policies of their own. So, for example, the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So this was invaded by Soviet Union. And essentially it became a long, drawn-out war where the Soviet Union found themselves as the occupying nation, fighting a dragged-on conflict that expended a lot of resources. It's sometimes been called that this is the Soviet Union's Vietnam, right? And eventually the anti-communist fighters there, the Mujahideen, who were anti-communist, very much what we might call pro-Islamic. These were religious fighters. They were fighters who really detested what they referred to as the godless Soviet Union, or the infidels, the Soviet Union being an irreligious state. And because they were fighting against the Soviet Union, despite whatever their official policies are, pro-Islamic, whatever, they then became an ally of the Soviet Union. So a lot of money from the United States went to the Mujahideen fighters, who were, again, able to repel the Soviet invasion, and that was very costly for the Soviet Union. Again, you have other internal rebellions. The Solidarity movement was a nationalist Polish movement. It was also Catholic. This is happening within the Soviet Union. You can think of this as being, the Soviet system is breaking apart. Sort of the ideology of communism is that workers of the world unite. So you put aside your religious identity, you put aside your national identity. You don't think of yourselves as Polish, you don't think of yourself as Catholic, you think of yourself as kind of a worker, right, among the revolutionary classes. And so this pro-Polish, pro-Catholic movement was threatening to break up, especially that Eastern Bloc in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev himself recognizes that the Soviet Union needs to reform in order to save itself. Perestroika and glasnost, these are Soviet reforms. They essentially will allow for a limited amount of free press, which is not the case in the Soviet Union, and allow for a limited amount of free, what we might call, let's say, capitalist enterprise, right? So to allow for a little bit of capitalism, a little bit of free speech. The problem is that when you let that door just crack a little bit open, it swings open. And pretty soon you had news stations that were very and highly critical of the Soviet Union. You had private economic ventures that were surpassing the state economy and really kind of making it look worse than it was. And so it's ironic in some ways that Gorbachev, in his effort to try and save the Soviet Union by reforming it, ultimately sows the seeds of its destruction. Meanwhile, though, even though Reagan was very combative, you might say, in his rhetoric, when it came to his actual diplomatic dealings with Gorbachev, the two were quite friendly, and the two struck a number of agreements in the 1980s. So we might call this the Gorbachev-Reagan relationship. And the two almost became friends. Ronald Reagan even went to the Soviet Union. News reporters asked him, like, hey, wait a minute, didn't you just call this the evil empire not too long ago? And Reagan said, you know what, that was in the past, and we're here to kind of work on whatever agreements that we have. And so that sort of very diplomatic, Soviet breakdown, escalation of the arms race, it is something that historians argue about, but Reagan certainly did contribute to the downfall and demise of the Soviet system. Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, he had been Reagan's vice president, becomes president in the 1988 election. And one of the things that George H.W. Bush promised while running in 1988 was the saying, no new taxes. All right, as we'll learn, George H.W. Bush doesn't quite have the same type of charisma and appeal that Ronald Reagan does. And so it makes him a one-term president rather than a two-term president, which Ronald Reagan was. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act essentially raised taxes. And so one of the things that made George H.W. Bush unpopular in the public for the United States or Americans' eyes was the fact that he had promised no news taxes and essentially had raised taxes, and that kind of turned a lot of Reagan's followers against him. It was under George H.W. Bush that the symbolic ending of the Cold War occurred. That was the falling of the Berlin Wall. So this is the symbolic ending of the Cold War. Ever since World War II, there was two different nations: West Germany, which was controlled by the U.S., and there was East Germany. And there was literally a wall that separated, specifically Berlin, which was an East German city. There was literally a physical wall that had separated them since the 1960s. In 1989, people from Eastern Germany got the green light that they could travel to West Germany. It had been prohibited before, but there was only supposed to be a limited number of people who were allowed to migrate. The people just went to the wall, they swarmed it, they tore it down with hammers, jackhammers, and the guards didn't stop them. And so when that wall fell and East and West Germany just became plain Germany again, that was the symbolic ending of the Cold War itself. A couple of years, or I would say in the years afterwards, the Soviet bloc itself began a revolt, and this was what we might call the Iron Curtain nations. Overthrow their communist regimes. So recall, ever since the end of the Cold War, ever since the end of World War II, essentially what you had in Eastern Europe was that those nations, technically independent, they all had communist regimes or communist governments that were put in place by the Soviet Union. After the Berlin Wall fell, those nations began to have these peaceful revolutions in which communist regimes were ousted and pro-capitalist, pro-democratic regimes were put in. I believe it was only in Romania in which there was a violent overthrow, but everywhere else there was peaceful transitions of power. And this was a clear indication that the Cold War was coming to an end. Meanwhile, George H.W. Bush keeps up the reconciliatory relationship with the Soviet Union. START is an agreement with the Soviet Union to reduce arms. This was unlike perhaps Reagan's stance. And a short while later, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union attempted to kidnap Mikhail Gorbachev, blaming essentially him for the dissolution of the Soviet bloc and the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. The Russian army comes to the rescue, and essentially right before the eyes of everyone on cable TV, the Soviet Union collapses. It becomes Russia and maybe 13 different countries, none of them having communist regimes, right? Communist powers. Now this puts forward a very interesting question about American foreign policy, because the question is, well, now that the Cold War is over, that East Germany no longer exists, that Poland has an anti-communist government, the Soviet Union doesn't exist, what is America's role in the world? And for the most part, what George H.W. Bush describes America's role after the Cold War is a new world order. Essentially, the U.S. will police and keep an active role in the world. And the first place where this gets put to the test is in Iraq. Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, in order to recoup money from the Iran-Iraq war, which was very costly, invades the country of Kuwait, so we could say invaded by Iraq and Saddam Hussein. George H.W. Bush goes before the American public, goes before Congress, goes before the UN, goes before an international community, says that this aggressive move by Saddam Hussein into Kuwait is unacceptable, and the United States needs to react and respond. NATO, which we've covered before, this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This was created to combat the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Well, there's no more Soviet Union, so what is the purpose of NATO? Well, in this case, in Operation Desert Storm, this was to oust Iraq from Kuwait. Oops. NATO troops are used in order to repel Saddam Hussein, and this ends up being a huge U.S. victory. George H.W. Bush is not just popular in the U.S., but really this move by the United States to go after Saddam Hussein and protect Kuwait from Iraqi forces ends up being one of the, ends up making George H.W. Bush one of the most popular presidents, really, since they've been recording popularity. And again, I would say probably the most important thing about Operation Desert Storm and the decision by the United States to intervene is this policy, because really after the end of the Cold War, there really was a question mark as to whether or not the U.S. would still remain active. That was partially answered by the U.S. Intervention in Iraq. This is George H.W. Bush right here, as you can see. Meanwhile, back home, though, George H.W. Bush was not as popular as he was in his foreign policy. Recall the promise not to raise taxes, and then taxes were essentially raised. Also, domestically, there was some controversy that was struck by the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. So he was nominated and eventually appointed to Supreme Court. That controversy began when Anita Hill had accused Thomas of sexual misconduct, and there were hearings that were made for this, and perhaps even though Clarence Thomas was appointed to the Supreme Court, this controversy about the allegations of sexual misconduct made George H.W. Bush unpopular with women voters. Another important contribution, though, and I would say this was probably largely popular by most Americans, was the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed by H.W. Bush, and this made it illegal to discriminate based on disability.